Value Impulses, the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A very warm welcome to the Profiling Values podcast. In our last episode, episode 9, we focused on the topic of a sense of responsibility. And following that, I think, very organically, is the topic of the importance of ethics for companies, episode 10 of our Value Impulses podcast. Maybe a little cliffhanger to start with, to give you some food for thought. In a survey by the FAZ, the following results came out. The majority of executives in Germany claim to possess high moral values. Yet, many executives do not act according to their own moral convictions in everyday life. What does that sound like? Well, I set my values and ideals so high that I can walk right under them, apparently. Only 1 in 4 managers regularly thinks about moral questions. 1 in 5 managers admits to acting only partially or not at all according to their moral convictions. The information comes from the 2019 executive survey conducted by the Values Commission and the Technical University of Munich. For background info, the Values Commission is part of the association. Initiative for Value-Conscious Leadership, the association since 2006. It conducts studies on the value awareness of executives. And I mean, at least 545 managers and executives from Germany took part in the survey. Most of them belong to the upper or middle management levels. Yes, I find that quite disastrous, to put it that way. Let's deal with ethics in a fundamental way. Basics, definitions. I mean, if we look at it from the very top, as Hartman does, then the highest point, scientifically and methodologically speaking, is logic. Yes, and logic goes into the natural sciences, with the organizing science of mathematics, under which the natural sciences like physics, chemistry, and so on are arranged. Below logic, however, there is not only the direction of natural sciences according to Hartman, but also the direction of value sciences. And the formal value science that Hartman founded is essentially the counterpart to mathematics. And it is then able to actually make the various applied value sciences measurable and calculable. And of course, ethics is ultimately one of them. But so is philosophy. And one could say, in turn, that ethics is perhaps even a subdiscipline of philosophy, the field of philosophy, but also those humanities, as they are still called, or they used to be called philosophies, like political science or sociology or psychology or things like that, right? So ethics is ultimately a sub-area, if you break it down, logic via the formal science of values. An applied science of values. And within ethics, there is general ethics, yes, normative ethics, meta-ethics, and so on. And then there is applied ethics. If we say there is medical ethics, environmental ethics, business ethics, engineering ethics, and so on, right? Let's take a look at the 3 terms that might be relevant here. Specifically ethics, then morality. And then also the term ethical conduct. And I would like to give you a few definitions for them and maybe some examples as well, to make it clear. Let's dive into ethics. You could say it is the scientific evaluation of actions, right? It used to be, essentially, the philosophical evaluation of actions, and there were, of course, major discrepancies. That is getting better and better now, especially thanks to Hartman's science of values. Maybe an example right away. An ethical evaluation in a company could mean that decisions are not just made based on financial profits, but also on how they affect the community and the environment, right? Maybe a second point regarding ethics. Yes, it is based, for example, on goods worth protecting, if you say that is the objective here, so to speak. As an example in a company again, a firm that follows ethical principles could focus on protecting the environment by using renewable energy sources, reducing waste, trying to neutralize its CO2 footprint, circular economy, or things like that, right? And you could, if you apply ethics to a person now, talk about an internal ethical navigation system, right? And what would that be? For example, a leader, one who has such an internal ethical navigation system, would refuse, for instance, to support unethical practices, yes, even if they promise short-term profits. So they would not compromise themselves. I think that makes the concept of ethics a bit more tangible. Let's look at the second term I have chosen, morality. Yes, it is on the one hand something like a social code of conduct, right? So an example of this would be that in some, maybe in many societies, in many circles, perhaps in many social classes, it is considered immoral to deceive in advertising or to make false promises as well. Advertising is also currently being discussed that certain ads should be banned, like for example, sugary foods for children and the like. That is, of course, always a very large area of discussion. What else do we have in terms of morality? Well, it ultimately regulates socially compatible interaction. Yes, and maybe an example here too. How could we phrase that so we don't just leave it hanging in the air? Social morality could ensure, yes, that companies treat their employees fairly and promote equal opportunity. Yes, maybe even let them share in the company's success. At this point, I'd like to refer again to Robert S. Hartman, who was already involved in the 1940s and 50s of the last century, in founding an association, and even led it at times, which was called the Association of Profit-Sharing Companies, which back then thought about and even implemented actually letting employees share in the company's success. Why? Because it turned out that they develop a completely different motivation there. And seen that way, yes, most of us have a variable portion on our pay stub. Or at least maybe get a variable portion at the end of the month, but by now that's often even spread out over the months. And that ultimately goes back to Robert S. Hartman, who also discussed this a lot with entrepreneurs. And at that time, everyone was actually advised against it. But there were numerous entrepreneurs who said, no, this is right, the employees get fully involved, they stand behind it. And today's studies also prove that the average employee only contributes about 60% of their energy, of their potential. And here, of course, you can simply unfold more energy, power, and potential. Maybe a word of caution here. This is not to be equated with bonuses for certain KPIs or certain quantitative goals achieved in sales or elsewhere. Research is now quite advanced in saying that bonuses based on very specific submetrics in the company are not conducive to the whole company because they attract, so to speak, bonus hunters, people who want nothing else than to maximize their personal pay stub, and there are hardly any submetrics in the company that don't also have negative effects if you pursue them stubbornly without keeping an eye on the rest. So that's why Hartman always started from the overall success of the company, including the total profit, and then distributing a fair share among the employees accordingly. So those are two examples of morality applied here, and now on to the topic of ethical conduct. Maybe just quickly, one could say, a personal orientation towards values might be one way to describe it. And if I take an example here, it might be a person, that is, a person who acts ethically, who could decide, for instance, to make ethical investments that are in line with their personal values, meaning their own value system, even if they might offer lower financial returns than what might be possible on the general market. Or ethical conduct, the willingness to take responsibility for one's actions. So an ethical person would take responsibility for their actions, even if they are unpopular, if they believe that they are right and ethically justifiable. and they wouldn't compromise their principles there. Or a third point for ethical conduct, it emphasizes the path itself and not just the result. So, for example, a company that acts ethically could constantly review and adjust its business practices to ensure that the way it achieves its goals is also ethical and sustainable. We had corporate social responsibility as CSR as an important factor. For companies for a long time, now increasingly called ESG as well, meaning environmental, social, and governance. And here in modern times, we have fortunately moved from the old shareholder value to stakeholder value, so shareholder, back then based on Milton Friedman. I've also mentioned it before in another episode. It's only about maximizing the company's profit, sort of a kind of predatory capitalism. And today, in many companies, we include the stakeholders accordingly. Because companies are an integral part of society. And it's not just the companies that are there. And the state, but also the people, the social groups, the environment, and much more. And the employees in the companies are complex beings, unique beings according to Hartman, with diverse motives and convictions. And every human organization needs a culture in which these individualities can also find their expression. And it also needs politics so that different interests can find a balance. Yeah, just because politicians set such a poor example for us, you can't simply say that politics isn't needed. For instance, in companies, every human organization needs politics to balance interests, to generate majorities, and to, well, remain pluralistic. In doing so, to avoid, let's say, potentially suppressing the best ideas, but rather to bring out the best in every individual and then also in the community. Ethics creates a sense of responsibility towards employees and the community. We examined the sense of responsibility more closely in the last episode. And ethics also enables a deep understanding of the complexity of people, right? So, respect for individual life is important here. And human life is Hartman's highest value, which he has demonstrated. And which, problematically, through Western philosophy from Aristotle until today, does not represent the highest value. Instead, the thoughts that humans have are, so to speak, placed higher than life itself. With the great danger that we humans get foolish ideas and thus, so to speak, endanger our own lives. And we only need to look at current politics and can then, I believe, say very clearly, yes, that's how it is, and we ultimately have to do something about it. Fifth point, or another important point here, ethics promotes credibility and trust in companies, you see. So if ethics is truly the foundation for transparent communication and respectful interaction, if there is, what's the technical term, informational justice, then we've laid a good foundation where everyone feels that, yes, I can also learn about the important things. And ethical action as a positive influence on corporate relationships with employees, right? It's very important that employees don't just enter into a deal like, here's my work performance for your paycheck, but that an identification is achieved also on an emotional level, which then generates energy, you know. Again, looking back at what I said, Hartman, profit sharing, here the to involve the employees in the company's success, yes. So, seeing ethics as an instrument for creating trust and also sustainable relationships. And especially in the current times, where we have such high turnover, such a high shortage of skilled workers, but also of labor in general, it is, as Retenken AG by Harold Huber, a business partner and friend of mine, so nicely puts it, retention, meaning commitment. Retention is ultimately the new recruiting, or at least a very significant part of it. Yeah, I'll just take an example and sketch it out in a few sentences. A company, for instance, could decide to communicate very transparently about its business practices, right? And then discloses how it maintains ethical standards throughout the entire supply chain, yeah. And that simply includes, for example, fair working conditions, environmental protection measures, yeah, social responsibility, yeah. And through this transparent communication, the company wins the trust of its customers, and maybe it also wins new customers and business partners more easily, HM. And this credibility leads to a positive perception of the company, strengthens relationships with customers and also suppliers, yeah, who are also looking at that more and more, and contributes to a long-term sustainable partnership, HM. So the example illustrates, I think, how ethics as a basis for transparent communication and respectful action can increase a company's credibility and thus contribute to lasting relationships. I want to put my final question here so that you, dear listener, might look into the question a bit more closely. Yeah. What concrete measures could companies take, in your opinion, to promote ethical behavior in their organization? I'd be happy if you wrote to us on LinkedIn, or you can also reach us at profilingvalues.com. Or more recently, I also have an author website, www.ali-vogel.com. Yeah, we'll put the references in the show notes, including the FAZ survey. And finally, a quick note about the next episode. In episode 11, I'll be talking about a change of perspective, yeah. How will the application process be revolutionized? Thank you for your valuable time. See you soon.